This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So before we went for a break on Friday, so on Friday we were looking at what is IIS, how to install IIS, and what exactly IIS does to something called as a Windows server. And then we saw how do you convert that particular server into a website, how do you use that, and all these things out here. And before leaving for that particular class, I've asked you all to go ahead and try out something called creation of a VM using an ARM template. This is what we were talking about. So, did anyone try this out? Let's say, did anyone succeed in, let's say, creating it out? Any issues with that? Yes. A parameter called DNS. Okay. There is something called DNS. Okay. Good point. There's a parameter called DNS is what it is asking. We'll talk about that too. We'll see what DNS really is. And yes, any more questions here? Sorry, any more challenges here that you're let's say facing? Anyone, anything? Storage account also. So yes, storage account also. So why do you need a storage account? Storage account, DNS, yes, and a couple of things out here. But we'll look at that. We'll look at how to create the virtual machine using an ARM template and what is the approach that I follow. What is the best practices that you can follow out here and all these things. Yes, before I get started, any questions still here? Anyone? Any questions still here? So let's see. If I create a virtual machine from the Azure portal, so let's say virtual machines, and I'll go ahead create one simple virtual machine today. Let's look at the options. Firstly, it's asking for your resource group. I don't have a resource group, so I'll go ahead create something called as a demo RG. Just one simple resource group out here. I'll say okay. It's asking the virtual machine name. I'll say demo VM. This is the name of the virtual machine. I'll say East US2. In my case, East US2 is a region that supports the creation of virtual machines, so I'm taking East US2. In your case, it can be different. Let's scroll down. There is something called availability options, which we'll talk about. Security, then image, sorry, image, and I'll say it's a Windows 2019 data center generation 2. I'll just scroll down. It's asking for a size. I'm good with this particular size out here. I'll give the username and also the password out here and reconfirm the password that I'm entering. So username and password is entered. I'll say the rules here. I want HTTP, HTTPS, and and RDP 3389. This is what I need. Three rules that I need out here. I'll say next. And disks, I'm good with. Let's say a C drive out here. I'll say next. Networking. And I don't have a virtual network, so I'm creating a virtual network out here. And I'm also creating something called as a public IP address. This is what I need, and I'll say next. And there is something called management. If you all would have observed this out, there is some there is something called monitoring. There is something called boot diagnostics. What does boot diagnostic means is very simple. Now even you would have faced this. Even a lot of people would have faced this. Sometimes you switch on your laptop doesn't switch on. It just tells there's some error in switching on, your laptop doesn't turn on, all that stuff. Now in even a virtual machine is nothing but an operating system. Operating system systems are prone to get corrupted. If they get corrupted, if you start your laptop or if you start your virtual machine, it'll just give you an error telling that you know what, the virtual machine failed to start, your operating system got corrupt. In that case, as an end user, like let's say I'm using this particular, let's say, virtual machine, as an end user, I want to understand what is wrong with my machine. In order to understand that, Microsoft has given something called as boot diagnostics. Use this feature to troubleshoot boot failures for custom or platform images. Meaning boot is nothing but startup. Let's say startup failures out here. All these logs that happen at a startup failure should be stored outside the virtual machine, because if I store it inside the virtual machine, it makes no point, because the virtual machine is any which way is not starting up. How do I even see the log? So for that, Microsoft recommends to go ahead and store that into a storage account. So if you want to go ahead and store it, meaning if you want to go ahead and enable it, you can create your own, let's say, storage accounts out here, and it stores all the data inside this particular storage account in the form of something known as append blob. We looked at something called block blob when we are doing it. We said append blob is for log information, and this is the log basically that I'm talking about. But in my case, since I'm testing it out, I can just go ahead disable this out, telling that, you know what, I don't need this. I can just disable it. If you enable it, that's where you will need a storage account to be created along with your virtual machine also. That's where in your ARM template, storage account is also getting created out there. In my case, let's say I don't want this. I'll say disable this out. I'll just scroll down. I'll disable the auto shutdown also. Advanced tags, review and create. So now it is validating whether I am eligible to create a storage, eligible to create a virtual machine or not. It's telling validation is passed. I will not create it. What I'll do rather is that, do you see something called download a template for automation here? Whichever resource you do, either it's a storage account, virtual machine, whichever it is, what Microsoft does is that before you create it, it will give you an option to download the template that creates this particular service. So if I download this template, it gives you the entire ARM template out here. This is all your ARM template telling what exactly your template is trying to do and what are the parameters your template has and how the template is actually referring to all these resources and etc. What I want you all to observe is just a couple of things. Just scroll down all the way to virtual machines. There's something called virtual machine size that I want you all to observe, and there is something called as the OS image, which is in the form of 2019 data center hyphen generation second, because I'm creating a 2019 server gen 2. Just copy this out. Do this before you go ahead and create a virtual machine using the RM template. So generation 2 is something that I want to copy. Sorry. This is the SKU. This is the parameter that is being passed for which the validation is successful. So I'll take this one. And also one thing that I want to take is the virtual machine size, which is coming from what? Parameters. Let's go into parameters. There is a parameter called virtual machine size. Where is that? Let's scroll down. Virtual machine size. Yes, virtual machine size. It tells it's a string, but it's not showing me the parameter, which is there in something called as parameter section. So I'll go here. Inside this, just scroll down, and there is something known as a virtual machine size out here. DS2V2, which is a valid size for my subscription. I'll copy this and I'll say size is DS2V2. So what are all the sizes allowed? So even in when you're creating this in a free trial subscription, also please make sure to note all these things down. What is the SKU? What is the size? And what is the location that you're creating this in? These are three things that I want to, let's say, note it down. And I won't create the machine here. I'm not creating the machine here because I want to approach this using an ARM template. So I'll go ahead and use my VS Code. I'll, let's say, open a new folder. I'll just go ahead and create a new folder out here today. And I'll say that it is VM Windows ARM template. Some name out here I'm giving. I'll say select folder. And once I select this out, I'll say Control N, select language, ARM. I'll wait for the template to load. And once the template loads, I will say ARM exclamation and Now this will take some time to, let's say, go ahead and load out. The resources will take some time. So even if I type in something right now, it won't give me something. So the resources section, this will take some time to load. But once it loads, let's again review the architecture of ARM template and understand, or let's review the architecture of a virtual machine and understand what are all the resources that you need, which gets created first, which gets created next, and all these things. So let's understand that particular order. So let's go there. So very firstly, to create a virtual machine, I need something known as a virtual network. I need a virtual network, and as and when I get a virtual network, I get some kind of an isolation. So it's let's say blocking the traffic from the rest of the world. Then I have inside the virtual network, I have a subnet. Let's say bring it forward. Sometimes this doesn't really work. Okay, forget about this one. Let's remove this out. Inside the network, you have something known as a subnet, and then we have a network interface card that gets attached to what? The subnet. And then you have the virtual machine that gets attached to the network interface card and gets the private IP from that particular network interface card here. Anything else I'm missing here in this architecture? Service endpoint, storage account, but I don't need a storage account at all. Not required. NSEs, exactly. Network security group rules. So let's go back into get the NSEs out there. So let's see NSEs, and I am attaching the NSG to what? Subnet. Anything else that I'm missing on? Anything else you feel, or anything else anyone feels that I'm missing here? Sorry?
Public IP.
User public IP. Exactly. Public IP, meaning I want also a public IP. So what I'll do, I'll put a public IP. And what do I attach the public IP to? The VM? Is it the VM directly? Yes. Sure.
NIC.
NIC. Exactly. The NIC gets the public IP and the private IP, and then the NIC gets attached to the virtual machine. That's how the virtual machine is taking the public IP and private IP out here. So let's see. Let's inspect the components. Let
Disk.
me disk. Yes, exactly. Good point. I need a disk that gets attached to the virtual machine out here. So let me get the image of a disk out here. Yeah, it should be somewhere. It should be somewhere out here. Okay, a disk that is attached to the VM. So all these are the components that I'm using to go ahead and create the machine. So let's see. I have a virtual network. So I'll say components, and let's make a note of all these components that we are creating. Virtual network. Then I have the subnet inside the virtual network, and we know how to create a virtual network and a subnet. After that, I'm saying NSGs, NIC, VM, public IP, and the disk of a VM. The disk actually is a child object, so I'll just put it inside the VM option. Disk of the VM option. This is all what I have. So the very first question that I have is that what is the resource that I should first create? Because now all these resources are interconnected with each other. If you look at this one, all these resources are connected to each other, talking to each other and everything. So my question is that, can I start with creating the VM and then create the other resources? First create VNet. Okay, first create VNet, exactly. So yes, VNet is something that I want to create, and inside the VNet, I want to create a subnet, and I want to attach this subnet to what? NSG. So in this environment, or in this, let's say, scenario, should I create the NSG first or should I create the subnet first? Subnet, and attach the subnet to what? NSG. So there should be an NSG to attach to it. So there should be an NSG in place to attach to it, which means that the creation of subnet itself depends on NSG, existence of the NSG, because I want to attach my subnet to the NSG out here, right? So the creation of the subnet itself depends upon the NSG. So subnet cannot be the first resource, which means VNet cannot be the first resource out here, because you are creating a subnet within a VNet. Can NSG be the first resource that I can create? Or does NSG depend upon anything else? NIC. So do we create NIC first or do we create NSG first? Because NIC should be created after the subnet is created, because it needs to attach itself to what? The subnet. So if it needs to attach itself to the subnet, NIC depends on the subnet, and subnet depends on what? NSG. So I cannot create the NIC before I have the NSG, because it has an indirect relationship. But can I first create the NIC, or can I first create the NSG? Does the creation of NSG depend upon any other resource? Just think about this one. Or can I just go and create it right away? Is it dependent upon anything else? Yes, no. Guys, I'm asking a question. So does this depend upon anything else? No. Sorry. RDP and all are the rules that are inside the NSG, not outside the NSG. So I can create. Doesn't depend upon anything. I can create this first. What about the creation of NIC card? What all do you think that the NIC card actually depends upon? In this diagram, what do you think you need before you go ahead and create a NIC card? Subnet also? Anything
Subnet and
else?
public IP.
Subnet, public IP, exactly. You also have something called as a public IP out here. So which means that you need, or the NIC card depends on subnet and the public IP. Since subnet is getting created as a part of my virtual network, I can say that it also depends upon the virtual network. And then let's come back to our VM. Does the VM depend upon anything? Or can I just go and create the VM? NIC? Exactly. The VM is just attached to the NIC. NIC is attached to the subnet. Subnet is attached to the NSG. And then this also has a public IP out here, which means that can I say the VM depends on the NIC? And NIC itself depends upon something else. Finally, a disk is something that I create inside the VM. So it's just like VNet and a subnet relationship. Public IP. If I want to create a public IP, does it depend upon anything else? It can be created individually. So it doesn't depend. Now, very importantly, when you create a public IP, especially using ARM templates or especially using some kind of an automation, it expects something called as a DNS name. Meaning, if I go and create the public IP in the portal, if I go ahead and let's say create the public IP in the portal, all I did is IPv4 standard. I said the regional. I gave a name, telling it is test IP, something like this. Scroll down. There is something called as a DNS name label. Meaning, if I give a label like this, something called as a demo label, some name out here, it just gives me an address called demolabel.ecus2.cloudapp.azure.com. Meaning, instead of using that number called 20 something, you can use this particular, let's say, address out here, which makes it a little easier for you. Instead of remembering a number, you can just remember this particular name label out here. This is called DNS label out here. And you need a DNS name label to be created before you can go ahead and let's say create a public IP out here. That's where DNS name label really comes into picture. And with this knowledge of all the resources, what I'll do, I'll go back into my ARM template and I'll start writing ARM hyphen Windows VM. I got the entire resources. So if you look at this template, all I did is just typed in ARM hyphen Windows VM and Microsoft gave me all these resources. So let's understand one after the other. Firstly, it's creating what? Storage account to store what? Boot diagnostics. But I am telling I don't need a boot diagnostics. So I'll delete this particular storage account block. I don't need that entire block of resource. I don't need a boot diagnostic. I'm just testing it out. If you need it, yes, you can create it, not a problem. And then I have what? Public IP
Good.
addresses. So what I'll do is instead of giving the name as a hard coded value, I'll use a parameter called a public IP address name string. And instead of giving the name here, I will call the parameters by using something called parameters public IP address name. I will parameterize this as much as possible. I'll try to make my template as much as let's say reusable. I'll just go down API version. It's telling location resource group dot location. Wherever your resource group is, you pick that particular location. I'm good with this. Tags, you can give tags or optionally again I can say this is tags and I can say the name here is parameters, say parameters public IP address name, and I'll say created by and give a tag value called ARM or something like this. Optional in nature. If you don't want, you can remove this entire block. Shouldn't be an issue. Scroll down. It's telling public IP allocation method. There are two kinds of allocation methods for a public IP: static or dynamic. What I'll do is I'll go to my parameters and I will allow the user to decide whether he wants a static or dynamic. For which, it's a new parameter. I'll say this is allocation method and I will give allowed value block, telling it is either static or dynamic. Again, just scroll down, see how that how the template is mentioning. So dynamic D capital, static S capital out here. So what I'll do is I'll put the same thing, comma static out here, and scroll down. And instead of using let's say the direct value, I'll say it is parameters allocation method out here, dynamic or static. Finally, you have something called as a domain name label. Whatever is the address name that you are passing, I just want to add something called hyphen DNS to that. So what I'll do, is I'll take all these things out. I'll say concat, meaning add parameters, public IP name, comma, DNS. Something like this, DNS ARM, something, meaning whatever name that you're passing to your public IP, I'm just adding it with another name called DNS out here, using something called as what? Concat, concatenation, to bind two things out here. Just scroll down. The second resource that I'm creating. So the first resource is done. So you can collapse this out. So it'll become easier for you to, let's say, go ahead and work on one resource at a time. Second resource is a network security group rule. How do I know that? Network security groups. Again, what I'll do, the name of this particular network security group is something that I'll go ahead and, let's say, parameterize out. I'll say NSG name. And here, instead of passing a value, I'll call the parameters, and I'll say this is NSG name out here.